Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Practical AI in Education, a conversation series. Today, we are having a conversation with Dr. Doug Magee. Um, and Dr. Doug Magee was actually one of my high school teachers. And one of the things I always remember about Dr. Magee was he was one of the teachers who made a consistent and conscious effort to experiment with new teaching methods and finding ways to implement technology into the classroom. So I'm personally excited to hear his thoughts and ideas as it pertains to AI. So I think a really good starting point, Dr. Magee, would be just kind of sharing your general thoughts about AI and what role it should play in education.
Thanks, JD. So generally speaking, I think as it relates to technology and learning, and that's just not like AI or using computers. I mean, I view like a book as a form of technology too. Um, the most powerful engine in the classroom is really a human, in my opinion. And the purpose for education is in order to create better humans and better communities and, better societies. So to the extent that any tool can help further those goals, I think it's worth investigating. And like the forms of technology that we have, at our disposal, I tend to view oftentimes as kind of like morally neutral until you apply some, ethic to it. And typically a human is doing that. Um, so all that said, my general philosophy is kind of like use it or lose it. If there's no purpose for it, then really it probably, creates an adverse impact on the learning environment rather than enhances it. This is probably before your time, but I think when I was a young educator, one of my favorite authors, kind of educational theorist, was a guy by the name of Neil Postman, who was kind of a social critic, wrote a lot about education, but also wrote a lot about technology. This was kind of like before computers, but just also understanding like how technology does shape the world that we live in. And sometimes we are passive about the ways that it may be shaping our lives. And I think my encouragement to anybody is that we take an active role in exploring what the potential impacts of it could be. And so, in a classroom environment, if AI can be used to augment, transform part of our practice, either from a learning standpoint or from a teaching standpoint, I'm in favor of teachers exploring practical uses for it. I mean, I think one of the things that JD, when you were one of my students, I just kind of explained to you some of the things that I was trying to do at that time, and now with AI, how that might be different. And so, at the time where you were in my classrooms back 10 plus years ago, we were giving students, an personalized adaptive external assessment called MAP. A lot of schools still do that. You could look at that as like early adaptive AI-based learning, where an assessment is like calibrating to where your strengths are as a student, and then immediately giving that data back to teachers, and that data helps inform like the instructional moves I may make to meet a student where they are and push them to the edge of their learning. Once I had that data and I knew who was in my classroom, like the second week of school, as it relates to just certain domains like reading ability, math ability, and then some like sub skills. And I could really think about how to program the learning experience in my classroom around some of those data points to help push students as far as, I possibly could. Of course, there are a lot of other things that we did in the context of the classroom, but in terms of some core academic skills, just look at reading in particular. I was a humanities teacher. And so if I knew the reading ability and the lexile range of every student in my class, and I know, for instance, in a class of 15 to 20 students, maybe 40%, 50% of my students are reading on grade level. Maybe 20% of my students are reading above grade level, and maybe 20% of my students are reading below grade level. I had a curricular tool that allowed me to adjust the lexile ranges of one text that I would be giving to every student. And then I would have, a learning management system that allowed me to assign the same resource to 3 different groups of kids simultaneously, and they all received it the same way as like we're just reading, whatever the text was. But kind of behind the scenes, what I was doing is trying to meet kids where they are and slowly like press, the academic rigor to get them to a higher point. Now, that took a lot of work on my end to do and to like organize all of that using several different systems. And the only way to do that, quite frankly, in an efficient way was using technology to my advantage to make that happen. With AI, the ability for any teacher to do that at any time is much faster. And you could probably do that with greater regularity just because of the power of the system that you have at your disposal. I think that's probably one of the greatest advantages that I see of that tool effectively. It's like putting a teaching assistant in every classroom, that is kind of economically prohibitive for schools to be able to do that and really out of reach for so many teachers. But when it comes to sort of like differentiating instruction or like thinking about novel ways to integrate several things teachers are trying to do simultaneously, but oftentimes don't have the time or the bandwidth to make that happen with regularity on a daily basis. I mean, those are some of the things that I think are probably the real advantage of figuring out how the use of AI could augment and enhance the practice of teaching and learning. What I just described to you is different than just like using AI in the classroom, right? Like there may be applications for that. And like we have courses at my school that I can share with you in which we are doing that. But where I see like the greatest advantage in terms of reaching and teaching kids is really trying to figure out, where they are at this particular moment in time. And as a teacher, how I can reach, a number of different kids in my classroom simultaneously and give them what they need. That type of work is like super complex. And, just transparently, you've been a teacher too for a little bit. It's just really like almost impossible from a time standpoint and planning standpoint to pull that off on a day in, day out basis. And so that's one of the things that's kind of excites me about what the possibility for AI is in a teaching and learning space. I'm less like bullish about the idea of like AI being a massive driver in educating kids. I think that will happen. I think that is happening. I mean, all of us are probably using AI as learners in some ways. The thing that I probably worry about a little bit more is I think AI probably has the capacity to replace teachers in certain contexts. I'm not sure it's the most humane thing. And I think, learning in general is like highly relational and community driven. Like that's the purpose for it, is to like oftentimes pass on culture, right? And so like we wouldn't want the machines passing on human culture to humans and effectively like doing the work of being human. And I think probably the population of society that would be exposed to that is probably low income populations. And that kind of I think that is, we should be concerned about that. I think that's all, I would just look for that. And I think that should be concerning to all of us in some way.
For sure.
I saw it's funny, I literally we just did a co-design session with some youth, and one of the feedback that they got, and JD, you were in on this as well, where it was like they don't want these tools to replace those student teacher relationships that they're building. And it's like, I think that's a concern that people should, I think, tune in a little bit more to, as far as like what the actual benefit of bringing these technologies into classrooms are. And I had one question just about like the utility of AI like in like these classrooms, because you mentioned that you have a system in place already, or like you had a system in place to understand like the data that you were collecting. So integrating an AI system into like that data mapping that you've already done is probably something that you as an educator can use more effectively. But do you see that as a roadblock for some educators who might not have been looking at data in that way? Or is it something that you think that like educators are always thinking about as far as how to manage and how to improve their teaching styles?
I tend to think that like there's a lot more data that's available to teachers now than there was before. And yet the symmetry of all of those systems are oftentimes not aligned. And so you get a little piece coming from this resource, from this resource, from this resource. And to some extent, that's probably appropriate because you're looking at, the student experience from different angles and different lenses, figuring out how to integrate all of those systems and then make it very specific to reaching and teaching a particular student or subset of students. That's where I think, like my interest actually is in my own practice, figuring out how to make a tool like that for teachers, because, for the most part, just in terms of like the job design, most of the time you are with kids doing the work. You're oftentimes you don't have the time, you don't have the bandwidth, because you're planning for the classroom experience, the learning event, to be looking at all of these other data streams. To some extent, that's, part of the work that I do and some other people on my team. But figuring out how to create a practical tool that's really localized within our ecosystem to be able to empower and equip students with, empower and equip teachers really with, something that's like very accessible, that, I have my curriculum plan, I have my lesson design, and I want to augment this lesson to meet like specific learning needs of students in this class, using AI as a tool to help you shape your practice around both your curricular aims and your instructional aims, being informed by all of those data streams, kind of in real time on a day-to-day basis, because, like an exit ticket or like a quick assessment that you did at the end of class yesterday is going to inform what you're going to do, today. But as you do that, there's all these other things that also may inform what you choose to do based on, your very specific contextual understanding of where your students are. And those are the things that I've been working on, currently in my practice, really, because I think empowering and equipping teachers to use the data, but oftentimes not as it comes to us through like our external assessment data or something like that. That if you all have looked at what that looks like, it's just like in aggregate, oftentimes very, comprehensive, oftentimes difficult to read, and then decide like, what are we, based on all of that, what should we do now? Which I think is what the question that teachers are ultimately asking. Like, this is all great, but what do I do now? And that's the thing that I think if schools can design tools for teachers to help them answer that question, great teacher is probably going to use every tool that they have to their advantage to help reach a kid.
For sure. I think, so touching on that last point you made, where teachers are kind of like, okay, we have all these resources and we have all this information, like, what do we do with it now? Like, how do you direct them? Like, what is the next step in your opinion? Like, how can a teacher kind of take that next step to actually figuring out ways to implement that inside the classroom?
Yeah, I think if there was like a system that is within, a particular school ecosystem and is kind of customized to your space, and obviously has all the privacy protections that are consistent with, any other of our school learning management systems, for teachers being able to ask very specific questions about how, like, give me 2 instructional strategies to consider when teaching, this particular lesson on cell division, that may come to them through kind of where students are in terms of their grades in that class, but also maybe what their reading scores are and a couple of benchmark assessments that could be external things like, we'd already talked about NWEA's map, but something like that, which helps connect kind of these longer term goals on measuring student performance in terms of their core academic skills, and then pairing that with a kind of like very specific objective that you have as a science teacher, being able to provide teachers with a tool that doesn't replace the work that they're doing in terms of curriculum design and instruction, but may help inform or augment that work based on some of these other data streams that I just don't think are always like top of mind when it comes to teaching and learning, because there's so many different priorities that you're working on. There's just like content coverage and skill development. Then there's also like the long-term, student growth trajectories. Sometimes you make decisions that don't always seem aligned or integrated. My hope is that you could try to work to integrate both of those things. Even like as a high school teacher, thinking about preparing your students for SAT or the ACT, right? This would be like another example. You can train, as we know, like you can train AI systems to like take those tests at a pretty proficient level. And teaching to those tests is not necessarily best practice, but if I was designing, a unit test for history and I have the test design created, I have the content that I work with, like I could ask the tool to create, or augment the design of my test in the style of questioning that students would likely see on the SAT, ACT. That's not necessarily, it's preparing them to take the SAT or the ACT, but it's not necessarily explicitly preparing them to teach to the test in that way, right? And I think that has always been a little, in schools anyway, like a little bit of a point of tension. The most effective way to prepare students for those assessments is really aligning the curricular experience with the type of questioning and exposure to answering questions in those styles that are integrated into your English class or history class, but aren't like taking a pause from that just to do test prep.
Right. So I'm interested to talk a little bit about like the conversations that are happening with teachers, right? And this idea of instead of trying to integrate AI directly into the classroom, right? Finding ways and systems that already exist and ways that AI can improve those. What is the response from teachers been like to that idea? Like, is that something that you're actively like encouraging teachers to do and to look into? Have they been like overwhelmed or resistant to that, or has it been like a positive reception?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, we as a like large faculty started doing professional learning around the use of AI in the classroom, and then we had a couple of like pilot design groups take deep dives into what integrating AI into their practice might look like. We also created some like policy guidelines about the use of AI in classroom spaces, really trying to think about like when is the use of AI permissible? When should the use of AI be sort of like utilized, but kind of with caution or in a discerning way? And then when should AI not be used based on the assignment or the objectives? And largely like that is to get at the question of being clear As I said, sort of about the use it or lose it type of idea. Like, it can short circuit the learning process and take on some of the work that we're asking students to do cognitively. And we don't want to be in a situation where students are offloading some of the cognitive tasks and therefore never developing that skill. And there are also opportunities where having facility with these tools can help further some of these endeavors. And so trying to be clear about that in terms of kind of the design of assessments or the design of projects. We've also had teachers build like custom AI tools in order to provide feedback for students. Some of those tools have been to provide feedback on their writing. Some of those tools have been designed as like a historical figure to allow students to interact with that historical figure. And then starting in our younger grades, I'm currently in a middle school. And so, you know, our just from an age standpoint, most of our students are too young to have just kind of meet the age permission requirements. But they do have a technology class, which really walks them through some of like not only digital literacy, but AI literacy, like talking about what is artificial intelligence, like it is synthetic in terms of that experience, just like other things that we might experience are kind of not in their sort of organic biological state. And so with that, there are just certain assumptions that we need to approach this tool with. And so there's kind of like an ethical component there, like helping students really understand where these tools came from. And because of where they came from, how they are designed, and how you might approach using some of these tools, which I think is like a healthy starting point before, and there's some, as they progress, there's some guided exposure to how to utilize the tools. But I think it really starts with, you know, the kind of decision-making, discernment, when one should use the tool. And then we have teachers that are kind of exploring the use of AI in some interesting and novel ways for, you know, experiential aspects, for feedback aspects. And most of those have been like very localized within our school context, using, you know, the content that we utilize, using some of the learning objectives and the skills that we, you know, espouse. And I think that's been going on for about 2 years. So the bigger project that I talked about was kind of like, you know, how to put sort of a teaching assistant in every classroom using some of our more like localized data and resources. And I think the 2 years of sort of exploration and reporting back to the faculty on how this is going with students probably primed people with some openness about, for teachers, how to use these tools. I should say, and this is like maybe interesting to our context, but I don't think so universally, as there are lots of interest in AI and families that want their students to be prepared to live in the world, especially with our younger students and the families of those students. I think there's also an increasing criticism, or at least critical lens, on the use of technology in education, period. And so, you know, I think our approach has always, as I said, have been kind of philosophically use it or lose it, and been very intentional about curating learning environment intentionally with certain tech tools that are really designed for the purposes of learning, not passive consumption of technology. And increasingly, though, I think like maybe a return to, for other schools, and I think we're at a pretty healthy place, but other schools like seeing the removal of some technology from schools, which may not be a bad thing.
Right.
How and this is, I guess, looking like at those younger students, right? Like, how are they processing like the difference in like what is real and what is not real? Because I feel like for young kids, a lot of times like they're developing, this might be a little bit before middle school, but like you have like the Santa Claus is real versus like Santa Claus is not real, and like AI as one of those things that like is producing content, but is that content like something that they're actually learning, or is it just like them repeating that? Is there like any, like, I guess, friction within that relationship as you're like teaching students or like introducing them to AI that you've seen, or do they pick it up pretty quickly?
I mean, I kind of would expand it beyond the use of AI. I mean, in the world that we live in currently, I think just the questioning of institutions and sort of like authority, and I'm not thinking about just like the law or leaders or government, just like news media, sources of like vetted truth, science. Like, I think all of those things, kids are growing up in the sort of age of increased skepticism anyway. And so I think that equipping kids with the skills to discern, truth, and how to arrive at something that is factual, that you can make claims about, that you have evidence to speak to. I think that is like kind of, that is technology in terms of education. That is not new, sort of like ancient wisdom. You almost look at, scientific method and the like, even, prior to that. But I think we just live in a world where that all seems less stable, and I find parents tend to be a little more anxious about that, and anxious about what that might mean for their kids. For the kids, they are just kind of like living in the environment that was created for them. I'm always protective of young people because I think, I get triggered by somebody who's older, probably like my age or older, being like, these kids today, but like the reality is they're just living in the world that was created for them. And in some ways we've made it much challenging for them, much more challenging. I also believe that kids are really resilient and they recognize truth, and I think maybe in some ways a little more savvy when it comes to understanding the dynamics of like the use of AI and augmenting, certain forms of reality. Like, I think they probably are savvier and more resilient than we think they are, and they're kids, so they make mistakes. And when that happens, the tendency of older folks is like, this is every child, and in my experience working with young people in schools that are all pretty thoughtful when given the opportunity, I'm like naively hopeful, but like I think actually kids are the core functions of how to be a human in the right environment is the way that humans act. And I think sometimes the adult commentary can make it more challenging for them. And, the other piece of this is, and I think this is the privacy aspect that I think we all should be concerned about. Like, there are people who are vying for like the information and access to young people that hasn't ever really happened in history. And I think they should be protected more than they probably are, there was that ruling, this week against Meta and other companies. I think we'll probably see more of that. I think sometimes in schools, teachers give kids access to things because the bar for like signing up for this free trial is pretty easy. I think teachers and schools need to be more discerning about just the easy access, because with that also comes maybe this trove of information about people that just because the access might be easy, low bar for entry, doesn't necessarily mean that you should just give kids access to that. And I think from an educator standpoint, we have to be more discerning about the tools that we put around kids and the purpose for putting those tools around students. And again, I'm going back to the thing I said at the head of this conversation, like use it or lose it. And there needs to be a purpose for the tool in order for it to have a positive impact on the learning environment.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. So I think we're getting kind of close on time here, but I think one great way to kind of wrap this up, one last question would be, Dr. Magee, if you could, and you've kind of given a number of valuable snippets that I think teachers and educators can kind of pick up from. But if you could give one piece of advice to like a middle school age educator who's trying to kind of get more into AI and navigate the space as it currently stands, what would that piece of advice be?
Not to be seduced by the shiny objects, I think sometimes, and as a young educator, JD, when you were in my class, like reflecting back, probably the person I was at that time, there were probably some things that I thought might have been novel and increased student engagement, but like I'm not sure if I would have approached it the same way now. I don't think that there's really any replacement for sort of the relational connection being the primary driver of anything we do educationally. And thinking about how to layer in the appropriate tools to further that work, and not to be distracted by like every new thing that is kind of out there, because ultimately, like, we want there to be strong relational connection so that you can push any person, I think about this as a coach, to the edge of their ability. And sometimes the technology pieces can be a distraction from that work. And you also don't want students navigating all of those tools. You got to think about like, what is the best tool for the job that you're trying to accomplish, and then make that be the core of your work. The most powerful tool, I think, is the relational tool. But I also view technology as like a pencil and a text. All of those things, are equally true about the work that we do. A piece of art is a form of technology, so figure out how what tools that you need to do the job, and then how to make the human connection in order to further the learning opportunity.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thanks again, Dr. Magee, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with us. I think there were a number of pretty valuable insights that you provided that can be kind of beneficial to educators, administrators, people from all levels within education, who may feel like overwhelmed with the new technologies that are coming out, and feeling the need to find ways to implement it, and like you said, sometimes kind of forcing it a little bit. But I think you provided some insights that they can consider. So thanks for that.
All right, Cap. Good to be with you.
Appreciate it.